Great to be here. So exciting. I think this is the first conference I've seen with a really content focus on Latin American market, which is very exciting. So Chris already gave a little introduction about myself. So I'd love for the panelists to give a quick introduction about yourselves and then your companies, just so the audience has that context.
Sure, I'll start. My name is Enrique Fuentes. I'm a Venezuelan living in Colombia. I've been creating games for more than 9 years, mainly for entertainment companies like Disney, Nickelodeon, as well as some video games companies like Atari and Namco. So it has been a ride of 9 years, trying to create some quality stuff from Latin America, especially for the US market. I also lead efforts on community development in Latin America. I founded IGDA in Caracas, Venezuela, then in Colombia. I co-founded with some other studios down there. There's a very interesting collaboration environment down there among studios. And I try to be as part of that as much as possible. So that's pretty much who I am.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks, Josh, for having us today, inviting to the panel and everyone that is here, especially during lunch. My name is Leandro. I'm originally from Argentina. I'm the CEO of Trick Gaming Studios. Trick Gaming Studios has a model that we see a lot around the area where we provide outsourcing services, or more specifically what we call nearshoring, because it's to Latin America. We have our offices in Buenos Aires, and that's where we are also, we founded IGDA Argentina, and we're also helping put together the different conferences there, IVA, and most recently IVA X in Mar del Plata. And well, that's it. I'm really hoping that I can share some of the experience that I have acquired these past 5-6 years that I have been working on this model.
Thank you, Josh, and everyone. My name is Giancarlo Mori. I'm actually based in San Francisco. And Movyl Entertainment, which is my company, focuses on emerging markets in general, and obviously in Latin America as well. So we're a publisher, and personally I've been in games since 1996, so probably a little longer than these guys, which probably betrays my age, which I guess is okay. Hopefully some wisdom will come with it. So I've been in console gaming until 2010. Companies like Electronic Arts, Activision, Microsoft, Game Studios, and more recently, before founding Movyl Entertainment, I was Chief Creative Officer at Glue Mobile and Head of Product at Atari.
Excellent. We have a very diverse set of panelists, which I think speaks to the scale and size of the Latin American market, which is obviously made up of many different countries. I think to start off, it would be great to just share some insights and sort of overview of the market in Latin America. Obviously, we could probably talk about this for the entire hour, but what are some of the key trends you see as far as gaming consumption, not just limited to mobile gaming, but PC or console in the different various key markets? What are the countries that Western developers you think should be really paying attention to? Either because they're the largest markets now or they're growing. So I think gaming platforms and then also the key countries and high growth countries. So you want to start?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say about that is I don't know if everybody realized this, but from Mexico to Argentina, the dominating language is Spanish. I mean, like every country with the exception of Brazil speaks Spanish, and Brazil is Portuguese. So it's like if you compare that to like Asia or Europe, in Western Europe you have like many countries in the same area, but everybody speaks a different language, right? So in Latin America it's mainly Spanish, with the exception of Brazil, which can kind of mislead into thinking that it's like the same culture across all the regions. So it's a very diverse kind of culture. But I would say it's very Western oriented, very much influenced by the United States culture. So if you see on the App Store and the games that are dominating the market are not that different from the ones in the US. So in that sense, it's also very different from Asia. I think it's a key thing in Latin America is that the games that do well in the US are the same ones that are doing well in Latin America. I haven't seen a specific case where there's a culturalization done in a specific game that has done really well in Latin America. Of course, there are games produced in the region, but with a very global vision and approach, and those can do well. I have seen other cases where people try to do something like very specific to the region, like let's do something with a theme that's very relevant for the region, and those don't do really well. So I think in terms of trend, it's pretty much the same as you would find in the US. You can go on the top chart, on the top grossing games, and you will find the same Clash of Clans, Candy Crush, the same games that dominate the US market. So in that sense, it's pretty similar to the US.
Great.
You want to add something?
Sure. I think in one point Joshua was raising it, I think it's worth addressing is the size of the region. So we're talking about 20 countries, more or less. Obviously, the top 5, both in terms of population, in terms of internet consumption, in terms of game consumption, traditionally, Brazil at the top, Mexico, and then Argentina, Colombia, and Chile, more or less in the same range. The other ones, obviously, are collectively very large in terms of a number of people, but they're much smaller in terms of opportunities. And as Enrique was pointing out, every country is different. So the market, legislative, carrier, particularly in the case of mobile, landscape is very different. So when we speak about Latin America, in reality, what makes sense is much more to focus on the top 5 countries that I mentioned. And in that sense, the population is very large. I don't know how many of you are familiar with some numbers, but just to throw some stats to frame the conversation, the entire region from Mexico all the way to Tierra del Fuego is 650 million people, more or less. That doesn't include the US Latino. There are almost 50 million Latinos in the US. So when you put together the whole region, independently from a language point of view, but more from a heritage point of view, you're talking about 700 million people. That's a very large. It's traditionally a very game-oriented part of the world. There are a lot of very passionate gamers. Xbox has done very well. PlayStation has done very well. There is a very strong component of PC gamers, very active. And in fact, that's one of the elements that is slowing down the penetration of mobile gaming in the region, even if you just focus on Brazil and Mexico, which are at the top of the list as far as spend, revenues, and population. The main reason is because hardcore gamers are still fundamentally playing on console and PC. That transition hasn't happened yet. The other transition that is still in the course of taking place is the penetration of smartphones. So paradoxically, everybody thinks that the infrastructure is poor. The mobile infrastructure is actually comparable to North America as far as the speed of the networks, at least in the major countries. So you have LTE, you have 4G, and so on. What's not as rich is just the distribution of smartphones. So it depends country by country, but you can assume that it's anything between 20 and 35%. Now, the element that is very interesting to keep in mind, at least for us as publishers, is that it's growing in double digits compared to the rest of the world. So it's comparable as far as speed of adoption to some of the fastest countries in Asia. So it's comparable to India, it's comparable to Southeast Asia. So when we take a look at the growth of the marketplace, it's very much comparable to some of the other countries where a lot of publishers are really paying attention to, while the rest of Latin America is really not necessarily a part of the world that a lot of companies are really focusing on.
Great. And in terms of mobile gaming, you talked a lot about some of the countries have a strong console PC. Is mobile gaming a fairly mass market thing for those who do have smartphones? Or is, like we see here, people are playing games wherever they are, if they're on their way to work, etc. Or is it still something that's really still growing?
I'll take that one. So, yes, like you say, that's something that is growing. It's growing a lot. As a matter of fact, these are statistics that I read for the growth from 2013 to 2014. So around 60 million devices were sold during 2013, and that jumped to 110 million devices in 2014, and we still need to wait for 2015 numbers. So something that, we have seen is that if Latin America still hasn't completely developed as a market, is I don't think one of the most. I think it's the one that is growing the most rapidly right now. So, like Giancarlo said, around 650, 700 million people living there. Only around 200 million, well, maybe more close to 300 if you count the Latin Hispanic living in the States. So that means the pool for potential new players in Latin America is huge. You have 300 million, 400 million people that still don't have access to internet or smartphones right now, that will probably have, not all of them, but in the next 5 years, the prediction says that Latin America is going to move from a 3-4% market share of the global revenue for games to around 10 or 12%. So that will put Latin America in par with markets like Europe, for example. And investing in Latin America right now may not be what we call a short-term investment. It's not something that is going to happen in next year or maybe in the next couple of months. But if we look at this in the next 5 to 7 years, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Excellent.
If I may quickly, two numbers that I think have framed what Leandro was saying as well. The total revenues for 2014 for games across the entire region, across all games, was about $4 billion. Of that, mobile games is 500 million. So if you compare, it's 1/8. Now, considering the growth, in a way we've seen this phenomenon play out already in countries like Russia or China. We'll see that will get much, much closer. Probably what's going to happen is that console gaming won't shrink as much, is that mobile gaming will grow to probably match what the size of the opportunity is. So we're looking at potentially doubling revenues to $8 to $10 billion. So at that point, you can imagine, as Leandro was saying as well, if you look at short-term revenues, it's probably not going to be a gigantic opportunities. But there are countries that are difficult to navigate for many reasons. Fragmentation, legislation is very different. The cultural differences are not critical, but they're significant. So starting early, I think it's absolutely important for anybody who wants to develop that part of the world.
I'm just kind of to round that idea, because I think it's a very interesting point. I think the key word here is growth. And the opportunity of getting into that market early on, and year over year, from 2013 to 2014, those $500 million, the growth was 60% year over year. So that's a huge growth, and I think that's where the opportunity lies in the region.
Excellent. So, as you mentioned, right now it's still a smaller part of the world in terms of monetization and total revenues. I mean, what do you see as some of the limitations, I think, around payment? I think that's a lot of developers see a ton of, I think, Brazil is one of the top download countries for Android, but in terms of grossing, it's, much farther down the list. Can we talk through some of the issues around payment, sure, with in-app purchase, payment behavior in terms of like premium games, and just get a sense of how are developers monetizing games? Is there things they could be doing better to drive more revenue from the installer user base they have in these markets?
So in terms of, it starts with a very basic problem, which is bancarization. There's a big percentage of people that doesn't even have a bank account in Latin America, which is similar to other developing countries. Of the ones that have a bank account, few are willing to use a credit card. So that's why the numbers are not so interesting when you go to ARPU or conversion, but it's actually growing. People, it's getting more comfortable using their credit card to buy stuff on a game, and you can see that it's again the same trend as in the US. If you see top grossing, most of them, not to say all of them, are free-to-play games with in-app purchases. Operators, going through operators hasn't been an easy thing either. I mean, the terms are not very favorable for the developer, which is something I think it's pretty similar to the US. You probably have more information on that, but yeah, I think the key thing is payment methods, because people is a little reluctant to use their credit cards to buy stuff.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, something I'd like to add to what Enrique just said. The adoption of credit cards right now across the region, I think, is really low, around 14%, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, that's a problem, and what it means is that for anyone that wants to publish in Latin America, you need to navigate, the problems in each country, and it's going to be different. For example, myself coming from Argentina, there's something there called Rappi Pago. So a lot of companies, what they do is you can go there, that's like you go to Walmart, you get $40 or $50 in credit, that gives you a coupon that then you can redeem in the store. So that's one of the solutions right there. It's a little clumsy because, of course, you don't have that, I need to pass this level, so I need to buy now. You have to kind of premeditate that you are going to be going to spend money, so it makes it a little bit more...
Can I add something there? Because I think there's something interesting in the Argentinian and the Venezuelan situation, which most probably not a lot of people realize, but there's a currency exchange control in both countries. So you can literally not buy dollars from the country. You have to use the local currency, and that poses another important limitation to those two countries. Sorry to...
No, it's okay. Exactly what I was going to say. And Giancarlo, do you want to add something else?
Yeah, I would say that the way to look at payments as a whole, I mean, instead of thinking about payments as a limitation, I think the best way to look at it would be to look at it as a creative way to find to overcome the challenges. For example, while it's true that as Leandro and Enrique have said, if you take the typical iOS or Android game that has been engineered to accept payments through in-app payments with iTunes and Google Play, obviously that's not going to work very well. So the emphasis is on looking at alternative ways to monetize. So if you're a developer and you're looking at taking your app in one of these countries, and by the way, this is not limited to Latin America, it's the same in Southeast Asia, to a certain extent, India, Middle East and North Africa as well, you need to think about what people are doing that you can monetize. So for example, ads. Implementing ad views and an ad monetization system is one of the ways that you can add the monetization, because there is no consumption, there is no payment necessary for the user. The incentivized ads work extremely well. The other thing that it's to be noted, a lot of publishers and developers don't localize anything. So they don't localize the ad copy, they don't localize the in-app purchases copy, they don't localize the game. So the problem becomes one, even if you want to buy something, the assumption is, well, they know English, they'll just pay. Well, that's a really bad assumption. Many people are actually relatively okay, have a working knowledge of English, but when you present them with a financial transaction, obviously the anxiety is already there. Now you're adding on top of it the fact that they don't quite necessarily understand what they're buying. Prices are higher. So if you look at the conversion of something in pesos, for example, real, it's not necessarily the same. There is an added premium on top of it because it aligns with the prices in the App Store in iTunes. So there is a reluctance to pay. And so I think it needs to be seen in a much more creative way, and it's a part of what probably these guys will agree, I personally call culturalization, which doesn't mean making a game that takes into account what the cultural background of the country is. It really means aligning the consumption of the game with the use cases that the gamers will adopt.
Excellent insights. So I think we already touched on this already. I think when we look at markets in Asia, like the sort of top genres and content tends to be potentially quite different. But it sounds like in Latin America, from the content side, it's fairly consistent, the Western market. Do you think that's because that's what users want, or because nobody's really created like local content that might be more appealing?
So one of the things that I think it's an interesting question. It's a little difficult, to be honest, to answer, because it's like saying I don't know, before sushi was popular in the US, do people like sushi or not? Well, nobody's tried. One of the things that we do know is that by and large, the consumption of content in general in the region is influenced by three major, I would say, influences. The US is probably the strongest. Europe is important as well. Don't forget that a lot of Latin Americans have kind of some sort of European background. Asia is another kind of a very strong background as well. So while it's true that in general the composition of the top 25 games in the App Store more or less are going to look a lot like North America, there are some differences. For example, mid-core games will over-index in Latin America compared to the US. Asian games are more popular than in the US. This is also, for example, represented by the popularity of Japanese games, like for example Nintendo tends to be a little more popular. We're not talking about double-digit differences, but differences that are critical. To the point that Leandro was making, I think in terms of understanding and being sensitive what culturalization really means, humor is a typical example of that. Humor in English is very different than humor in Spanish. And humor in Mexico is going to be a little different than humor in Brazil. So you have to be sensitive, try to understand what the kind of the key points are going to be. So the insidious part is that 75% to 80% is going to be the same, but that 20-25% can make the difference between being relevant and being irrelevant. And the trick is to obviously have partners and teams that are based in that part of the world, that really understand. So having a partner, whether it's a studio, whether it's a development partner, whether it's a distributing partner in the region, I think is absolutely critical to be able to understand what things are important versus what's not.
Excellent. So we touched on some of the sort of insights for Western developers interested in the market around, making sure you're adding monetization to actually drive revenue if it's through advertising, being sensitive to the different cultural differences, localization. Are there other tips that you would provide to, mobile developers from outside the region if they're thinking, I'm really interested in penetrating this market with their content? Are there other insights or tips that you provide for them to really think about if it's, evaluating the potential of your game or other, feedback that you can give to help them, have higher potential of success?
Well, I think it's mentioned time and time again that Brazil is number one, and like if you want to start in Latin America, you should probably focus Brazil and Android, because Android has a much bigger penetration in Latin America than iOS. I'm not even going to talk about Windows Phone. It has less than 10% there, but yeah, I mean, if you want to start in Brazil, it could be a little misleading to think that that's, whatever you do in Brazil, it's scalable to the rest of Latin America, because Brazil is like a continent in its own. It's like you can carve it out, and it's even the language is Portuguese, and the culture there they pay a lot of attention to things that are originated in Brazil, right? And that are only popular in Brazil. And I think that's a little bit of an exception with the rest of Latin America, that we're very, very influenced by the US. But that's the only thing I would add. I mean, if you want to start in the Brazil market, pay attention to what they consume. Have a Brazilian partner for sure if you want to cater to that specific market. And because things like, there's this portal there, called Jogos, and that portal, it's bigger in traffic than what's the name of the portal? Click Jogos, yeah. So I know you knew. So that portal, in terms of traffic, is bigger than Congregate, and it only caters to the Brazil market. And how many of you knew that about that portal? click jogos. I mean, so I mean, it's like nobody knows it outside Brazil. Very few people do, and it's actually bigger than Congregate.
Excellent. Any other?
Yeah, if I may add, I mean, in my opinion, you need to look at Latin America. Enrique is totally right in terms of Brazil being different. It's 250 million people, by the way, so it's a very, very large country. I would say, to add to what Enrique was saying, probably the best bet is to focus on Brazil and Mexico, because Mexico is a little more representative. It's large. It's 120 million people. It's the size of Japan. Just to put things in context, not in terms of revenues, but in terms of size of the population. It's very urbanized, so the result, kind of the percentage of the population lives in larger cities is very high. To give you one data point, Mexico City is 22 million people, so it's a sixth of the population right there in one city. So those two countries will give you a good sense of what the rest of the Latin America can do. Now you're attacking Brazil, Portuguese, and you're attacking Mexico as kind of a representative of the Spanish-speaking. But you can do it by yourself. That's the equivalent of going to China in 2010 by yourself, or going to India today. You need to have local partners. As I said, difficult to navigate, different legislation, carrier landscape is totally different. The carrier billing is very complex to do. The language is different. You don't even know what the right partners are going to be in terms of distribution. What is the right price point? So they're all things that require local knowledge. So I would say that the one example, whether you're a publisher or a developer, finding a partner in the region, I think it's absolutely critical. Otherwise, it becomes extremely difficult to operate. And you'll end up actually with I can tell you what the self-fulfilling prophecy is going to be. You're going to have a bad experience. You'll think that there is no market, and you'll move back, which is what a lot of people have done, and probably one of the reasons why the market is not developed in part. It's also because there's a lack of attention. A lot of people are focusing on Southeast Asia and in China, and they're leaving fundamentally the market to be developed.
Excellent, interesting. So obviously, besides your companies yourself, are there any other companies that have been really successful in the mobile gaming space that have come from the outside into the Latin American market? Is there any examples of company, like some of the larger companies in the market, like Gameloft or EA or whoever, that have really had a successful strategy and to penetrate the market, not by accident, but actually purposeful strategy? Any insights into what they did to garner that success? And if the answer is no one's really been successful, that's fine too.
So no, yeah, I mean, I call it the second wave right now of studios. Like, I don't know, the industry, of course, is pretty young in Latin America. I would say has no more than 15 years since the first real studios started. And I think about 8 years ago, there was a surge in amount of studios, especially in the countries I know best, Venezuela and Colombia. And I think right now, a lot of that, studios that were there because, let's make an Angry Birds, right? And this should be a fun business to be in, are realizing how hard it is to actually make successful games. And now I think we're reaching a point of, I wouldn't call it maturity, but at least there's the ones that survived that first wave. And it's, normally I would say it's around 5 to 10 studios per country that are at a level where you would say, okay, these guys know what they're doing. It was before, it was like 40, 50 studios doing stuff, but it was 3 guys, 4, 5 guys. Not really knowing what they were doing. So I think right now we're approaching a very good point. And of course, there are very successful cases. One of them is Kingdom Rush from Ironhide. I don't know if you guys know, but it was made in Chile, in Uruguay, I'm sorry. And I just found out a couple of days ago that Fallout Shelter was made in Chile. And I didn't know that. It was made by Behavior Chile. So, I mean, there's very interesting, successful cases, especially in Chile, Argentina. Colombia is also starting to become an important spot for games development. A lot of focus on mobile. I think there are a few studios that are doing PC/console because of the scale of investment it requires, but I think there's a lot of interesting mobile development going on.
Excellent.
Yeah, I like to add on what Enrique was saying. So this is a curious data I think that we can throw in regarding the Argentinian case and things. Everyone has heard probably about Trivia Crack. That's a game that was done by Ethermax in Argentina. That game, I think, surpassed the 200 million downloads. And something to take into account is that that game may not reflect at all, or maybe only in a small portion, about the revenue generated inside the Latin American industry. There are a lot of problems with the currency exchange in Argentina. It's hard, to get the dollars out, to put it somehow. So what I'm guessing is that at least 80% of the studios there, they must be making their revenue in the States. So the 22 billion or so, 25 billions of revenue that are today in the United States video game industry, part of that is probably coming from studios from Latin America that have this problem with with monetizing inside the country. So that's just something to take into account.
I would say the key, in my opinion, is to look at what happened on console. Because as we said, the mobile market in Latin America is not developed enough yet, and not a lot of people are doing anything specific. So it's difficult to point to anyone. So there are two cases that I would use. One is Facebook games. There were a couple of companies in 2012, 2013, in Brazil particularly. One is called the Vostu, it's still around. They were extremely successful for a while. Their attitude was to take what Zynga was doing in the West and adapt it to the Brazilian market. They did very well for a while. I think they then suffered what everybody else did, which is just the Facebook games stopped being very popular, so the wave moved on to mobile, but they're still around. But they were able to capitalize on the fact that there was a platform that was growing. There was an appetite for a certain type of game, which were city building or a farm building and so on, and adapted to that culture. So that's a good culturalization more. The second one I would say that did extremely well on console, which I would say are specific, because if you take Call of Duty, for example, or Fallout, these are games that obviously will do very well. They're global phenomenons, or Halo. The two that I would say I actually have some experience with, one was FIFA, that keeps doing extremely well in Latin America. Now, it's an obvious case because those are very passionate soccer countries. But it doesn't stop to that, because EA could have taken, and I used to work at EA on FIFA, so I know that from the inside out. We didn't just take FIFA, put it in Spanish, and throw it out there, which is what everybody else would have done. There was marketing efforts being done in the country. There were marketing managers in the country. On the top of the box, there was that FIFA as a player for each country. There was an effort made to make the game relevant to that particular user segment. So it's not necessarily about culturalization as much as about still making the game sold in a way that from a marketing point of view stands out of the crowd. So I would say that no one is doing it in mobile yet, but one of the main reasons is because everybody else is paying attention to the US, China, and Western Europe. There is more attention paid to Russia right now and India than there is to Latin America. I think at the moment that a publisher will start focusing on those territories, I think they'll find the formulas that resonate with local consumers. But that's the key.
Interesting. Yeah, seems like it's a high growth market that potentially is less competitive than a lot of the other markets internationally or in the West, which potentially makes it attractive to mid-tier developers here.
Can I add something to
that?
Yeah,
Sure.
Because I think one of the key things beside the growth is the fact that we talk all the time about how ARPU is lower in Latin America, to your point. But at the same time, user acquisition costs are very, very, very low. So if you
don't tell everyone, don't tell all the secrets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So no, it's very high. Sorry.
And one quick point actually to support what Enrique is saying is the trick is not to look at Latin America and say, well, I'm going to make a game and I'm just going to make it for Latin America. Obviously, you made a game already. 90% to 95% of the cost have already been incurred. The cost of localizing a mobile game, you can probably take it on Unbabble and have all the strings in your game localized for less than $10. In actually a pretty good quality level. There is not a lot of voiceover. The additional efforts that you do it through digital marketing. So the actual cost, the delta cost of taking a game from the US or wherever the key territories are and distributing in Latin America, very small. But the increment in terms of revenue can actually be non-trivial. So I don't see the reason why nobody should try it.
And I wouldn't worry too much about culturalization.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, the first thing you do is you localize it, you distribute it in Latin America. If the game does very well, then you take a look at the next step, which is really do kind of that extra level of market adaptation, which we would call a culturalization.
Excellent. So we've talked obviously a lot about Latin American market, south of the U.S. From different perspectives. We touched on it earlier that I think one of you said there's 50 million Spanish-speaking folks in the United States. We'd love to get any insights around that potential opportunity for mobile gaming companies. I mean, my sense is that nobody really is addressing that market specifically with any specific type of content. It's really just, hey, my game's in Spanish, and you can adjust the language if you want in the app. Any interesting insights there around the opportunity or what any companies are doing? Is this something meaningful that developers should consider? And obviously it's another high growth population. Anyone want to?
Well, I can kind of probably use a very quick example that I think we probably should frame the conversation. Nobody, by the way, is doing anything about, as far as I know. There was a study published by Univision that is actually a very interesting group that does Latino and Hispanics studies in the US. As you know, Univision is an American company. Univision is the example to follow. So Univision has fundamentally said, okay, there is 50 million Latinos. They're obviously many of them are American citizens. They still have a very strong cultural connection with their countries. There is something to be done there as far as catering content that is appealing to them. So they are doing a good job as far as television goes. There are a lot of actually paper publications, magazines like Latino Woman and so on that are fashion magazines or lifestyle magazines that are specifically tailored to that segment of the population. The two things that I would say is it's probably one of the most interesting and forgotten in the gaming industry parts of the US population for two reasons. They tend to spend more on entertainment than non-Latino US citizens. And the other one is the largest and fastest cultural group in the United States. So you know that now there are more Latinos in California than non-Latinos. They spend more in games, as I said, than non-Latinos. And if you take a look at Latinos versus non-Latinos, what type of games they're playing, they're actually quite different. They over-index on action. They over-index in adventure games. They under-index on casual. And in casual, they tend to over-index in kind of a very casual games like non-skilled based casual games like, for example, Candy Crush and so on. So there is something there that is unique. The study is available. I mean, if you can find it, send me an email. I'll be very happy to point you in the right direction. But it's interesting enough because it's different enough that I think if you really put some creative thought into that, there's some stuff that can be done. And I know that Josh wants to talk about social media. I think the trick is fundamental, not to give the store away, but it's social media.
I just wanted to add a very quick, information there that Los Angeles is the second city in the world with most Mexicans. After Mexico City, it's Los Angeles. And insert your Donald Trump joke here.
Excellent. Well, this is really, really interesting, and I have plenty more questions, but I wanted to open questions to the audience, if there are any. Oh, right here.
Hey, so I'm from Brazil, so I'm pretty used to the crazy stuff out there. So the legislation in particular, it's like a nightmare. So good luck to anybody who's going to try. But I also have no idea how it is outside of Brazil. So like how, because Brazil like really got to understand like it's a very, particularly the last 12, 16 years, very, very incentives driven, a lot of like rules that you got to follow to get some extra money and to do things in a particular way. So I don't know what it's like in the rest of Latin America. If you guys could let me know.
Yeah, but in terms of what, regulation or
yeah, like regulation,
incentives?
what are the kind of things you got to know that the government's going to mess with? Like I would just give a simple example. In Brazil, for many years there was no games in the App Store because the legislation said that to ship a digital game you needed like a little sticker in the box saying the age, and of course digital game does not have a box. Therefore, we were pretty much impossible. You couldn't ship legally a digital game in Brazil for years. And then they fixed that small oversight a couple of years ago, and now you can actually have games in Brazil, digital games. But like that's a small thing that affected the industry pretty strongly for like 2-3 years. Like nobody could sell anything. Yeah. But I don't know. So I don't know if there's things like that to watch out for. Incentives. But there's another thing that if you partner with a Brazilian company and do things in a specific way, you can get some money from, or at least some tax benefits. So there's like different ways you can like kind of use the system. So I don't know what it's like in the rest of the...
Yeah, so, I mean, it varies, as you know, from country to country. Like we mentioned the case of Argentina and Venezuela, that you can't bring money in or take money out at all. I mean, it remains there in the country, so that's a little problem. And there are also some... In every country in Latin America, there can be a little bit of a political agenda around the subject. So, for instance, in Venezuela, aggressive video games are illegal. Bellic video games are illegal. I mean, you can go to jail, literally, if you doing that kind of thing. So, it varies definitely. But I think in terms of incentive, I can speak more deeply about Colombia. The government has tried to provide some incentive for developers. Like I said, there's always some kind of a political objective. So normally it's educational games that have some impact on the on the culture of the country, which don't necessarily sell well. So a lot of studios become like funded by those funds, and project after project they don't really take off as independent studios. So I think that's a bit of a problem we have in the country. More than that, we have been trying to get some kind of fiscal incentives around video games. They did achieve a very important fiscal incentive around movies in Colombia. So there's a law right now that gives back a bunch of money to anyone that produces a movie in Colombia. I think it's 50% even. So we're trying to get something similar, like why these guys get that and we don't, right? So we're trying to get something like that, but at this point there isn't much around that area.
Okay. Yeah, I will expand on the Argentinian case. Unfortunately, I cannot generalize to all Latin America because it's so big, so many countries. But in the case of Argentina, to add more examples, right? So you got some artificial laws that the current government, for example, put there are constraints on bringing devices from outside the country. So everything has to be assembled in Tierra del Fuego to the south. So what that means? That means that the lead platform over there is Android. I think like 78% in Argentina versus only 13% for iOS. But these are things that change all the time, right? By the end of this year, there are elections and the new government may come with a different agenda, so it changes and it opens new opportunities. So you always need to be prepared, to read and, get the proper connection inside the country that can read these trends, is living with these trends. With the dollars, taking in and out the money. Of course, there are, as you know, parallel currencies. One is the official, one is the not. So what a lot of companies do that is completely legal is they buy bonds and then they sell those bonds for what they would cost, to buy $1 of bonds, translate to pesos in Argentina. It's hard to pull off, but it's completely legal and you can do it, and you just need to have the right connections to be able to work around those things that unfortunately now they are hurting the region. It's difficult, but probably as more and more businesses start to grow, there will be a change in politics, right? Policies.
Both. Hopefully.
Other questions?
Hi. I heard you mention a couple of times that you need a local partner to address the market, and I heard you mention like alternative payment methods and things of that nature. So if we're talking about the mobile games market, and I have a game that's successful worldwide, what exactly would I need a local partner for? Like what are the things that what local partner would help out with, and touching specifically about the alternative payment methods, which are, from what I know, not allowed on Apple and Google stores. You can't really add anything into that.
I would say that the critical thing is customer service, user acquisition. It works in a different way. I mean, Enrique mentioned UA. If you don't know what you're supposed to pay, you'll end up overpaying. I can assure you that the delta between the information you find on the internet, or that some of the classic and kind of worldwide ad networks tell you should expect in terms of CPI versus what the actual CPI you can get if you know how to work there, it's dramatic. It's 1 to 4. It could be even more than that. So it's PR. The press works in a very different way. It is social media. These are very social countries, very social oriented. The landscape of social media networks is very different. It's fundamentally, by and large, is Facebook, and that's it. If you forget kind of the messaging apps, but Twitter is not strong at all. It's growing, but it's not there at all. So it's really doing all the things that your Chinese partner is going to do for you, from understanding what type of additional distribution stores you need, which one the right ones. There are alternative payment methods that you can use for Android. You write about iOS, but you can implement additional payment methods. Yes, you can. It's been done all the time. Whether Google is aware of that or not, it's done all the time. For example, the system they were talking about is called the Boleto in Brazil, and it's done in mobile games currently. Advertising, how much you should use advertising, what is accepted in terms of number of impressions versus where do you place your ads and so on. That is the type of things, what type of incentives, what is your D1 versus D7 retention that you should expect, and how do you incentivize. So it's fundamentally not necessarily live operations as far as process, but the particular type of live operation and how do you manage your title so that it can be successful there.
Anybody from Apple here?
No, Apple actually, it's technically impossible to do.
Yeah, and also to mention something, there are, of course, alternative stores, and you have companies like Naranja. They have, I think, deals with carriers for carrier billing in at least 10 countries right now. So they have a huge network, they publish for you, and it's all transparent to the developer. You just build their SDK into your game, and they will take care to customize and make a deal for you in any of the stores, in any of the countries that they support and have carrier billing deals right now. So that's one example of how to do it.
Yeah, that's a very important one, because if you think, again, being Google Play is sufficient, in reality, every carrier has their own content store. So, for example, Telcel has one in Mexico, Claro has one in several other countries. And knowing people in those organizations obviously is what gets you featured and discovered. So it's not just being featured by Google. And by the way Google makes decision or Apple makes decision about the featuring is not necessarily done only here by Google and Apple themselves. There is a relationship between the local office and the Mountain View or the Cupertino office. So navigating all these differences can make the difference between making some good money or not. And the difference in terms of cost is not particularly high. Especially if you have a game that is doing very well and it's already visible. So you can kind of surf that wave very effectively. And usually a lot of partners, including my company, works out of revenue share. So there is no cost to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something else that this may be a small detail, but when you do your app store or your store optimization, you have to take into account that every country calls things in different names. So TV shows, like we say cars. if you want to do, if you have a racing game, you have to put different keywords for Argentina, for Mexico, for Chile. So that would be a small detail where someone that is a partner in that country will help you come up with the right keywords.
Any other, one last question if there is anyone? No? Okay, awesome. Well, this is really insightful. I appreciate it. All three of you, a round of applause, please. So obviously, if you're interested in Latin American market and you have content, you can talk to Giancarlo and he can potentially help you. And if you're looking for, development support in the market, Enrique and Leandro, and I think they'll be around a little bit potentially if you have additional questions. Otherwise, thanks very much.
Thank you.